They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when blood becomes the only bond left, when it no longer flows outward but turns inward, collapsing upon itself? Imagine a house where the father is also an uncle, the mother is also a sister, and children grow up not knowing whether to call someone their cousin, their sibling, or both. This is not a work of fiction, not a Gothic novel pulled from dusty shelves. This was the lived reality of a family line in America that carried on a cycle so disturbing it is spoken of only in whispers. For generations, this bloodline folded in upon itself like a snake devouring its own tail until the very walls of kinship collapsed. And in one haunting chapter of this story, a sister became a wife. What kind of family makes that choice? Was it desperation, isolation, or something far darker, a desire to preserve blood at any cost? When you look back through the records, you don't just see names on faded paper. You see a legacy of children born into confusion, of faces marked by features that mirrored one another too closely, of lives weighed down by the invisible burden of inherited sins. It wasn't just marriage that tied them together. It was a pact against the outside world. And as you follow the story deeper, you begin to realize this was not just one mistake, not just one forbidden union hidden in the shadows. It was a pattern, a blueprint of survival written in secrecy and silence. Each generation carrying the stain of the last, each one tightening the walls around them until escape seemed impossible. Tonight, we open the locked doors of that history. We step into a forgotten home where family ties became chains, and where the question was never, who will marry whom, but which sister will become the next wife. This is the story of America's most inbred line, and the choices that bound them together in ways that still unsettle us today. To understand how a sister could become a wife, you have to step back into the soil where this family tree first rooted itself. It was not in the busy cities of the East, nor in the rich farmland of the South, but in places where isolation carved its own rules. In America's forgotten hollows, hidden by mountains and rivers, there were families who lived and died without ever straying more than a few miles from where they were born. Roads were scarce, schools rarer still, and the law, though it existed, often looked the other way. In these valleys, the outside world was a distant rumor, and family was not just your kin, it was your entire universe. It is here, in this suffocating geography of isolation, that cycles of inbreeding took root. At first it may have seemed like necessity. Who else could they marry when the nearest town was a day's walk away and strangers were met with suspicion? A cousin might have seemed like the only option, but as years became decades, those boundaries grew smaller. Cousins became siblings, brothers became fathers of their own nephews, and eventually the most unthinkable bonds, sister and brother, wife and husband, were bound together in marriage. The local whispers were cruel. Outsiders who encountered these families spoke of faces that looked too similar, of children who seemed different, both in mind and body. But the family themselves carried it as both a shame and a secret. The sister who became a wife may not have chosen freely, yet in the family's eyes, she was fulfilling her duty to blood. It was a silent vow, passed from one generation to the next. Protect the line, even if it means destroying it. The tragedy is not only in what was done, but in what it left behind. Children born into these unions often bore the weight of inherited sickness, minds clouded by the echoes of too close bloodlines. Some lived short, difficult lives, their names vanishing from the record before they could even reach adulthood. Others grew up trapped in the same cycle, bound to repeat the choices that had already consumed their parents. This was not survival. This was entrapment masquerading as tradition. And by the time the world outside came knocking, curious, judgmental, or horrified, the damage was already woven into the family's very blood. There is something unsettling about reading old records from this family line. The handwriting is neat, the ink faded, but the words tell a story that feels almost inhuman. Birth certificates where the father's name and the uncle's name are one and the same, marriage records where a sister's name is written beside her brother's as though it were the most natural union in the world, and beneath those documents, the cold silence of children's names, so many of them ending abruptly, their lives swallowed before they could bloom. The deeper you read, the more you sense the silence behind the paper. These people did not leave behind diaries explaining why. They did not write of love, of longing, or even of shame. What they left instead was absence. No justification, no confession, just an unspoken truth carved into generations. That silence speaks louder than any words. It tells you this was not something done openly, proudly, or with celebration. It was done in whispers, in rooms where the walls held secrets no one dared to repeat aloud. The sister who became a wife did not simply marry a man. She married into a blood pact that had already claimed others before her. Whether by coercion, by fear, or by a twisted sense of duty, she became part of a legacy that erased her individuality. She was not just a woman, not just a sister. She was a vessel to continue a family line that had no intention of letting the outside world in. And in this, her story merges with countless others who were trapped in similar cycles across the forgotten corners of America. When you look at these unions, you realize the horror was not always visible to the eye. On the surface, it was a wedding like any other, a name etched in ink, a home built on shared blood. But beneath it was the quiet horror of children who would inherit confusion, sickness, and the weight of secrecy. Some locals remembered them with a mixture of pity and unease, speaking of children who seemed touched, of faces that bore the same heavy features generation after generation. The documents cannot tell you how she felt. Was there despair in her heart, or had she been taught since birth that this was simply her destiny? Did she resist, even in silence, or had the chains of blood convinced her that this was the only path? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is what makes them linger so hauntingly, because in that silence we hear the echo of a family that locked itself away from the world until the world could no longer ignore what had been done. As you peel back the layers of this story, the horror begins to shift. It is no longer only about forbidden unions, but about the way blood carries memory, how trauma itself can be inherited. When a sister became a wife, she was not simply crossing a line of morality. She was helping to forge a cycle that would bind every child born after her. Their blood carried the weight of her decision. Their minds carried the shadows of choices made long before they were conceived. Modern science now gives us words that these people never had: genetic bottleneck, recessive disorders, cognitive decline. But at the time, all they had were observations whispered in dark corners, children who struggled to speak, young men who never grew strong, daughters who bore the same sickness their mothers did. To the outside world, these were signs of tainted blood. To the family inside, they were simply life, inevitable, unchangeable, the result of loyalty to kin above all else. It is easy to condemn from a distance, but imagine being born into this world where every path forward curved back to your own family. Escape was not just difficult, it was unthinkable. To step outside, to marry beyond the blood, was to betray the very people who fed you, raised you, and bound you in silence. And so, generation after generation, the doors remained shut. The blood ran closer, and the children bore the cost. The sister who became a wife became something more than a tragic figure. She became a symbol, a reminder of how fragile the human line is when it folds in on itself. Her story is not isolated. Across America, in pockets of deep isolation, similar stories took root. Families who chose blood over survival, secrecy over salvation, each one leaving behind echoes that still ripple through time. When we speak of this line as the most inbred, we are not only speaking of numbers, of how many cousins wed their kin. We are speaking of a psychological prison, a structure so strong that even those who suffered within it could not break free. That is what makes this story haunting, not just what was done, but how it was carried silently for so long. If you've stayed with me this far, then you're already braver than most. Because by now, you know this is not just a story about marriage records and whispered rumors. This is about stepping into a world where every choice is bound by blood, and where love itself is reshaped into something unrecognizable. So let me ask you, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have bent under the weight of family duty? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. The further you follow this family's trail, the more disturbing the patterns become. Outsiders who stumbled upon them described it like stepping into another time, faces that seemed too alike, voices that carried the same rhythms, as if individuality itself had been worn down. There were children who could not speak clearly, others who struggled to understand the world around them, and yet, within the family, these differences were accepted as normal. They were not judged for what they were, because no one knew what life looked like beyond those walls. The sister who became a wife was not an isolated figure in the records. She was one among many, her story etched into a line that refused to reach outward. And though her name may have been forgotten by history, her role in the cycle was not. Every child she bore carried the legacy forward, cementing the line deeper into itself. This was not romance, not choice. It was survival redefined, twisted into something that blurred morality until right and wrong no longer had meaning. Historians who study families like these often find themselves caught between pity and revulsion. On one hand, you see people trapped by isolation, bound by poverty, crushed by the weight of geography and circumstance. On the other, you cannot look away from the choices that continued long after escape was possible. That is what makes this story so unset. Cling. It was not just necessity. At some point, it became tradition. At some point, it became identity. And when you realize that, you begin to see the true horror. This was not a single mistake, not a hidden scandal buried in shame. It was a legacy, carried proudly within the family, even as the outside world recoiled in horror. And for those born into it, there was no undoing what had already been written in their blood. The tragedy of this bloodline is not only what it did to those within it, but how the outside world responded. When strangers caught wind of these families, the reaction was rarely compassion. They were not seen as victims of isolation, but as curiosities, freaks, something to be whispered about and mocked. Stories spread like wildfire, children with twisted limbs, adults with vacant stares, households where no one could explain who was whose parent. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others brutally true, but all of them painted the family as less than human. And yet, behind closed doors, they were still human. They still laughed, cried, worked the land, cooked meals, and prayed. They still dreamed, though their dreams were shaped by walls no one could see. The sister who became a wife was not a villain. She was a daughter born into a system she could not break, a woman told since childhood that her worth was not in choice but in duty. To the outside, she was a horror. To those inside, she was simply another link in the chain. That chain, however, grew heavier with each generation. By the mid-20th century, when America was shifting into modernity, families like these were being dragged into the light. Journalists, sociologists, and even law enforcement began documenting them. Photographs surfaced, faces marked not just by genetic similarity, but by something deeper. A haunting emptiness, a look that spoke of lives confined before they even began. This is where the horror deepens, because you realize these people were not monsters, they were victims. Victims of geography, of silence, of choices made decades before they were born. And yet, because the outside world needed someone to point at, they became America's living ghost stories. The sister who became a wife was not remembered for her humanity, but for her violation of taboo. Her children were not seen as individuals, but as proof of a family line collapsing into itself. And so the cycle of cruelty did not end with blood. It carried on through shame. A family already broken by isolation was further shattered by the gaze of outsiders who could never understand the prison they had lived in. That gaze still lingers, preserved in photos, in records, in hushed stories passed from one generation to the next. What lingers after the documents, after the whispers, after the photographs is not just the story of one family, but the reflection of something far greater. The sister who became a wife was not the beginning, and she was not the end. She was a chapter in a cycle that reveals how fragile the human condition becomes when isolation, secrecy, and duty twist the rules of blood and love. Her story is unsettling because it forces us to ask questions we would rather leave buried. How much of who we are is determined by the families we are born into? How much choice do we really have when the weight of generations presses down on us? The legacy of America's most inbred line is not only genetic, it is psychological, cultural, almost spiritual. Even today, descendants carry the scars. Some changed their names, moved far away, and built new lives in an attempt to sever themselves from the past. Others remained unable or unwilling to escape, clinging to a bloodline that was already collapsing under its own weight. And still, outsiders seek them out, cameras in hand, eager to stare, to judge, to consume the horror like entertainment. Few stop to see the tragedy behind the spectacle. The sister who became a wife disappears into the shadows of history, her name blurred, her face forgotten. Yet, in many ways, she is the heart of this story. Through her, we see how love can be distorted into duty, how survival can transform into self-destruction, and how silence can be more damning than confession. She was not a monster nor a villain. She was a woman born into a prison without walls, where blood dictated every path forward. And so we are left with the haunting truth. Some families are not just broken, they are bound in ways that defy escape. The soil of America is littered with stories like these, buried under layers of shame and secrecy. We dig them up not to mock, but to remember, because in their darkness we see the thin line between survival and ruin, between loyalty and destruction, between family and the collapse of family. The question that echoes long after the story fades is one you must carry with you. If blood demanded it, how far would you go? Would you walk away? Or would you become another name in a forgotten archive where a sister can also be a wife?